All right, welcome back, everybody. It's time for Chapter 11? Chapter 11 of Dodger. This is like the fourth reading I've done today alone, and yet I still don't know what chapter that I end on. Don't worry about that so much. Anyway, Chapter 11. Dodger smartens up, and Solomon comes clean. Solomon had been waiting up for him. He hadn't been in the neighborhood audience because no room in the attic faced the street. His windows instead looked out on one side of some warehouses, which Solomon had considered a much better view than the kinds of things you have to see on the street itself. Only a very few words were exchanged in the darkness before Dodger flopped down on his mattress, and at last the candle was snuffed. As he snuggled down under his blanket in the knowledge of a day well filled, Dodger watched his own thoughts swim past his eyes. No wonder the world spun. There were so many changes. How long ago was it that he had heard a scream and jumped out of a foaming sewer? How many days was it? He counted. 3 days. 3 days! It was as if the world was moving too fast, laughing at Dodger to keep up with it. Well, he would chase the world and take what came and deal with it. Tomorrow, he would be attending a wonderful dinner at a place where there was certainly going to be simplicity, and it appeared to him, as tiredness built up, that the important thing in all of this was how you seemed, and he was learning how to seem. Seem to be a hero, seem to be a clever young man, seem to be trustworthy. That seemed to fool everybody, and most disconcerting thing about this was it was doing the same to him, forcing him on like some hidden engine. And with that strange deduction still in his head, he fell asleep. The following morning, the man whose job it was to open the doors of the Coates Bank to the customers found himself looking at an elderly Jewish gentleman in a ragged gabardine suit, whose eyes gleamed with mercantile zeal. This apparition pushed past him, followed by a young man in an ill-fitting suit and a nasty-smelling dog. Among some of the other clients, there was some murmuring about poor people coming in there until it turned out, after every coin above the rank of 6 pence was duly bagged and signed for, that these were poor people with a lot of money. A receipt and a shiny new bank book were received, and the little party swept away as fast as they had come in, and the Red Sea closed again, and the planets wobbled back into the rightful orbits, firstborn children once again played happily, and all was right with the world. Except that part of it now contained one of Mr. Coates' senior partners, who was realizing that somehow he had agreed to a rate of interest that they seldom offered, but he had considered cheap at the price if it got Solomon out of the building before he threw out the moneylenders. The suggestion was, of course, ridiculous and unfounded in every respect, but Solomon nevertheless was always a winner when it came to bargaining, and it tended to leave everybody somewhat dazed. As soon as they got outside the bank, Dodger reminded Solomon, somewhat reluctantly, that he was due in the offices of the Punch magazine so that some artist or other could draw a picture of him for the front cover. Mr. Tenniel turned out to be a young woman, only a little bit older than Dodger, whose brown hair seemed closer to red. With Dodger in a seat in front of him, the two of them chatted away while the artist drew. Or young man. I said young woman, didn't I? I'm sorry. My brain. Being drawn by Mr. Tenniel wasn't all that difficult, and a lot less difficult, Solomon said, than being drawn and quartered, at least. That was apparently a Solomon joke, and one he didn't explain to Dodger. Perhaps, Dodger thought, he should have said that the process was not difficult but occasionally worrying, because Mr. Tenniel would scribble and then suddenly dart a glance towards Dodger, which pinned him like a butterfly, and then just as soon disappear as Mr. Tenniel got back to scribbling again. Only the top of his head could be seen as the artist bent over his work, while Solomon sat drinking coffee and reading a complimentary issue of Punch. To Dodger's amazement, being drawn didn't take very much time, and finally Tenniel made a sudden few last-minute adjustments to the portrait on his easel and turned it toward Dodger with a grin. "I'm pretty pleased with this, Mr. May I call you Dodger? I think I have your essence down pat, but of course the paper is always somewhat cluttered, and I will expect to add a few other details to give the public some vision of what happened in Mr. Sweeney Todd's shop. I need to draw Mr. Todd too, you know. The public demands both hero and villain." Dodger swallowed. But Mr. Todd wasn't really a villain, sir," he tried. Tenniel cut him off with a wave of his brush. "I hear that Talvera was a most dreadful battle. They say that Wellington simply threw men forward into the mouths of cannons and abandoned, and to great loss of life. One can only hope that the deaths were worth the sacrifice, if that could be possible." He shook Dodger by the hand and went on. Mr. Dickens told me the truth about what transpired on the day in Fleet Street, and it is wonderful, is it not? How the public perception of what is true these days seems to always bias towards the macabre. It would seem that the common man likes nothing so much more than an horrible murder. He paused and added, "Is there something the matter, Mr. Dodger?" As often as Tenniel had closely scrutinized Dodger, so had Dodger in his turn scrutinized him. He had seen not what was there, but at one point seen something very subtly out of kilter. It took a while for him to see it properly and to find the words. Embarrassed at being caught staring, he decided to make a clean breast of it and said, "I do believe you have something wrong with your left eye, don't you, Mr. Tenniel? I hope it ain't too much of a drawback in your profession." The artist's face froze and then thawed into a lopsided smile. "The scar is so small that I believe you are the first man I have met to notice it. In fact, it was a trivial childhood accident." Dodger, watching the smiling face, thought, "Not, I think, so trivial." "Charlie was right in what he said about you the other day." "Oh? What did Charlie say about my friend Dodger the other day, if you please, sir?" Solomon rumbled, standing up and packing the magazine into the depths of his coat. "I would very much like to know." He smiled, of course, but the wording was emphatic. This was most certainly picked up by Tenniel, who blushed and said, "Since I have put my foot in it, sir, I can do no more than tell the truth. Will you please not tell Mr. Dickens that I mentioned it? What he said, in fact, was, 'Mr. Dodger is so sharp that one day his name will be known on every continent, possibly a benefactor of mankind, but also quite possibly as the most charming scoundrel ever to be hanged.'" Mr. Tenniel took a step backward in amazement when Solomon, laughing, said, "Well, at least Mr. Dickens is a wonderful judge of character, and directness in a man such as himself is admirable. But should you meet him before I do, please tell him that Solomon Cohen is endeavoring to see that your first opinion will prevail. Thank you very much for your time, sir, but please excuse us now, because I must go with the young ruffian to a place where he will get cleaner than he's ever been in his life, because this evening we are due to go to a very important dinner engagement in the West End. Good day to you, sir, and thank you, but now we really must take our leave." "No time to dawdle, Dodger," said Solomon as the door closed behind them. "You know how keen I am on bathing? Well, we are today going to have a Turkish bath with all the trimmings." This was news to Dodger, but Solomon's wisdom and efforts at basic hygiene had kept him alive so far, so it was almost inconceivable for Dodger to thwart his friend on this occasion. He dared not argue for fear that Solomon's righteous zeal would cause him to drag Dodger there by ear. Acquiescence was better than becoming a laughingstock in all the rookeries and stews. And so, putting a brave face on it, he followed the old man out into what was really a drizzle with smoke in its eye. They unhooked Onan from the lamppost where he had been tethered in the certain knowledge that nobody would ever want to steal him. Dodger felt better when he cogitated on the word Turkish. Somebody, probably Ginny come lately, a nice girl with a laugh that made you nearly blush. They had been quite close once upon a time, had told him about Turkey. She had filled his mind with exciting images of dancing girls and light brown ladies in very thin vests. Apparently they would give you a massage and then oil you with what was called undulates, which sounded very exotic, although to tell you the truth, Ginny come lately could make anything sound exotic. When he had mentioned this to Solomon, Dodger had been much younger then and still a bit naive, the old man had said, "Surely not. I have not traveled widely in the countries of the Levant, but whatever else they do to their goats, I'm quite sure they don't rub them all over their own bodies. The goat has never been distinguished by fragrance of its aroma. I suspect you mean unguents, which are perfumes distilled from fragrant oils. Why'd you want to know?" The younger Dodger had said, "Oh, no reason, really. I heard somebody say the word." Right now, though, whatever way you put it, the word Turkish conjured up visions of Eastern promise, and so he became quite optimistic as he strolled through the streets all the way to the Turkish baths in Commercial Road. There were, of course, bathhouses all over the place, often even used by those who were really poor when, as old lady had put it to Dodger, sometimes you need to knock the lumps off. Often the baths were ordered just like the rest of the world, but in that the more you paid, the more likely it was that you got the hottest and cleanest water, which was, at least before the soap went in, transparent. Dodger was aware that in some of the places the water had the knobs had bathed in ended up in the baths habituated by what you might call the middle classes, traveling afterward to the great bath for the lower classes, where it at least arrived soapy, if you took the cheerful view meant to savings. Even though you might never sit down at a table with mayors and knights and barons, at least you could share their bath, which made you proud to be a Londoner. The rain was falling faster now, rain that was undeniably London rain, already grubby before it hit the ground, putting back on the streets what it had taken away by the chimneys. It tasted like licking a dirty penny. The door to the bathhouse was up some steps, although there was nothing much else to recommend it. It certainly didn't look like a haven for nubile Nubians of any kind. Once inside, however, they were greeted by a lady, which set Dodger's spirits up a bit, although the fact that she turned out to be quite old had something of a mustache lowered them once again. There was a muted conversation between her and Solomon. The old boy would haggle over the price of a penny bun, but had apparently now met his match in the old woman, whose expression suggested that the price was that well known, take it or leave it, as far as she was concerned, and she would be very happy if he left it as far away as possible. Solomon was not often thwarted in his determination to haggle the cheapest price for everything, and Dodger heard the man mutter the word Jezebel under his breath just before paying what turned out to be the keys to a couple of lockers. Of course, Dodger had been to the ordinary public baths many times before, but this one, he hoped, might be more adventurous. He was rather open to the prospect of being oiled. So, clothed only in large towels, their feet slapping on marble, Solomon and Dodger stepped out into a huge room, which looked rather like hell would look if it had been designed by somebody who thought people deserved another chance. It was full of strange echoes you get when steam, stone, and humanity are all in one place. To Dodger's dismay, there were no signs of the eagerly anticipated ladies in thin vests, but shadowy figures, male figures, were visible everywhere in the steaming gloom. At this point, Solomon put a hand on Dodger's shoulder and whispered, "Be careful of the Percys, a word to the wise." This word to the wise left Dodger no wiser until the penny dropped, and he said, as they were stepping down to the nearest bath, "This isn't the first bath I've been in, but I think it's the prettiest. The Percys never bothered me before." "God really seems to have taken it up against them," said Solomon as the hot water rose up their legs. "For myself, I can't see why, because it seems to me that, in a small way at least, they're doing this small planet something of a service by not helping to fill it with unnecessary people." There wasn't just one bath in the baths. There were sweat baths, cold baths, hot baths, and right now, clambering down into the bath with the two of them, there was a gentleman wrapped in a towel with biceps bigger than most people's thighs, who said in a voice like a grinding mill, "Would either of you two gentlemen require a massage? Very good, very thorough. You will feel the benefit, and afterward you will be right as ninepence, yes?" Dodger looked at Solomon, who nodded and said, "You should try it by all means. They tend to be rather brisk in here, but afterward you will feel the glow." He nodded to the man and said, "I will take a massage myself along with my young friend, and we can talk and relax." Afterward, Dodger considered the massage had not been relaxing, unless it was that you felt so much better when it stopped. But while the two masseurs twisted and pummeled with no other interest in their victims/clients, he unloaded his thoughts to Solomon, occasionally punctuated with an ouch. "I'm glad Simplicity is safe where she is," he said, "but she will be in danger every time she goes for a walk, and as far as I can see, there ain't nobody in the government who would do nothing to help her. Ugh." Said Solomon. "That is because the government thinks mostly about all the people. They're not very good at individuals, and undoubtedly there will be those in the country who consider that handing her back against her will might save any bad blood between the two countries. And indeed, although I fear to say it, it would be a Christian act, since after all she is the wife in the eyes of God. Although, Dodger, God sometimes appears to be looking the other way, and I have often told him so. The wishes of the husband are invariably considered more important than those of the wife." "That man last night was working for a cove called Sharp Bob, who is, ouch, interested in Simplicity and me," Dodger said between blows. "Wants to know where she is, so there must be money in it for him. Do you know him? I heard tell that he's a legal kind of gentleman." "Sharp Bob," Solomon mused. I believe I have heard of him. Ah, yes, he is a lawyer for criminals, you might say. I don't mean getting them off in front of the beak. He does that, certainly, but he's more of a go-between, you might say. Someone will approach him and say, as it might be, there's a gent in our town who I'd like to see inconvenienced. Nobody would say anything about killing or chopping off an ear, because it would be done simply by looks and a touching of the nose and little signals just like that. Just so that Sharp Bob himself can say that he knew nothing about the matter or why somebody's dining room had blood all over it. Solomon sighed. You say his man are those who attacked Miss Simplicity? Yes, and I need to find out, Dodger said, as soon as we got this business tonight out of the way. I had to have got the whereabouts of the Sharp Bob off that cove last night, but I was, kicking him in the crotch at the time, and I forgot to do anything about it. I think I had perhaps punched him heavily on the conch as well, flattened it over his face, so all he could say was grunts. Let that be a lesson to you, said Solomon. Violence is not always the way to resolve things. Solomon, you have a 6-barreled pistol back at home, said Dodger. I said not always. Well, if you know where he might be, let me know, 'cause tomorrow I'm after him anyway, Dodger said. Maybe he reckons that someone would be happy to hear Simplicity was dead. Not 'cause they hate her, but just because she's, in the way. There was a very long from Solomon, which at first Dodger thought was because of an extra special twist from the masseur. Then Solomon said quietly, Well then, Dodger, you have answered your own little conundrum. Let them hear that Simplicity is, dead. No one hunts a dead man. Just a point that crossed my mind, of course. No reason to take it seriously. Dodger looked at Soul's expression, and his eyes were shining. What do you mean? I mean, Dodger, that you are a very resourceful young man, and I have given you something to think about. I suggest you think about it. Think about people seeing what they want to see. A fist came down on Dodger with a thump, but he barely noticed it as his brain began to clamor and then started to spin. He looked back at Solomon and just nodded with a glint in his eye. Solomon loomed up then like a whale and patted his arm, saying, Time to go, young man. There is such a thing as being too clean. No sooner had they got dried off and back in their cubicles than Solomon said, We should sit here for a little while for a drink. It doesn't do to go out immediately after bracing massage. You could catch a fever. After that, my boy, I will introduce you to Savile Row, where all the top men go for their clothing. We haven't got much time, but last night I sent a boy over to my friend Izzy, who will see you right. His place is no shonky shop, and I am certain he will give a good deal to an old friend who incidentally carried him to safety when the Cossacks shot him. He added, He had better. Running. I carried him for more than a mile before we lost him in the snow, and none of the three of us had boots on, having been woken up at night. And after that, we went our separate ways, but I'll remember young Carl, I believe I have mentioned him to you before, saying to me that all men are equal, but they are downtrodden, though sometimes they do their own treading. Now I come to think of it, he said a lot of other things too. Worst haircut I've ever seen on a young man, and wild eyes too. Reminded me of a hungry wolf. Dodger wasn't listening. Savile Row is in the West End, he said, like a man talking about the ends of the earth. He went on, Do I really need toff's clothing? Mr. Disraeli and his friends, well, they know who I am, don't they? Oh, and that, what are you exactly, my friend? They're subordinate, they're employee, or I would suggest they're equal. That's what young Carl certainly would have said, and probably still does, unless he's no longer alive. Dodger gave Solomon a strange look, and Solomon hastened to clarify. As I recall, if you go around telling people that they are downtrodden, you tend to make two separate enemies, the people who are doing the downtreading, and I have no intention of stopping, and the people who are downtrodden, but nevertheless, people being who they are, they don't want to know. They can get quite nasty about it. Intrigued, Dodger said, Am I downtrodden? You? Not so you would notice, my boy, and neither do you tread on anybody else, which is a happy situation to be in. But if I was you, I shouldn't think too much more about politics. It can only make you ill. As a matter of fact, I certainly believe that some, if not all, of the people you will meet tonight will be considerably richer than you. But from what I have heard of the lady in whose house we will be dining, I have reason to assume they will not think this means they are that much better than you. Money makes people rich. It is a fallacy to think it makes them better, or even that it makes them worse. People are what they do and what they leave behind. Solomon drained his coffee cup and said, "Since it's a long way and my feet hurt, we will take a growler and behave like the gentlemen we are." "But that's a lot of money." "So, I should walk all that way in this rain? What are you, Dodger? You are king of infinite space, provided that said space is underground. You are a man who picks up money for a living, and because you have a wonderful eye for it, I think it makes something of an everlasting child of you. Life is fun with no responsibilities, but now you are taking on responsibilities. You have money, Dodger, as that shiny new bank book proves. And you hope to have a young lady, yes? This is a good for a man, because responsibilities are the anvil on which a man is forged." Just as soon as they were outside of the bath, Solomon had to rescue an elderly lady who had simply patted Onan. He helped her brush herself down, and then both her dress and Soul's handkerchief were cleaner. He hailed a cab, which stopped without the driver having meant to his horse's hooves, leaving sparks on the cobbles. Once they were safe on the cushions inside, with the London rain and all its stickiness falling outside the windows, Solomon sat back and said, "I have never really understood why these gentlemen seem so hostile to their clientele. You would have thought that driving a growler was a job for somebody who liked people, wouldn't you?" It was pouring down now, and the sky was the color of a bruised plum. It was not a good day to be a tosher, but the night might be. With any luck, Dodger could be back after dinner where he belonged, underground. With Solomon's recent lecture in mind, he amended it mentally to the place where he sometimes chose to be. He felt he would need to be there because he was once again feeling not entirely sure about himself. He was still Dodger, of course, but what kind of Dodger? Because he was most definitely not the Dodger he had been a week ago. And he thought, if people change like this, how can you be sure about what you get and what you lose? I mean, these days, well, getting into a growler, easily done. The kind of lad who goes around in growlers, not the lad with the arse hanging out of his trousers who used to run up behind them and try to hold on. Now I actually pay. Would I still recognize the boy? It looked as though the weather was shaping up to be a storm akin to the one from the night in which he had met Simplicity for the first time. In front of them, the coachman himself was out in all elements and weathers, which may have had something to do with the growling, and surely only the horse could be doing the navigating in this downpour. There was nothing in the world but rain, it seemed, and now, against all rules of nature, it seemed some of it was even falling upward, since there was no room anywhere else. At this point, Dodger heard, only very slightly, the sound he had for days been subconsciously listening for. It was the squeal of metal in pain, and it was ahead of them. He dived towards the little sliding plate that enabled the inmates of the growler to speak to the coachman, and he ever wanted to listen to them. The water splashed on his face, and he yelled, "If you overtake the coach in front of us, the one with the squeaky wheel, I will give you a crown." There was no answer. How could you hear one in these crowded streets and vapor and flying water? But nevertheless, the speed of the growler suddenly changed, just as a puzzled Solomon said, "I am not at all sure that we have a spare crown on us." Dodger wasn't listening. A growler had a lot of places where somebody with quick wits could grasp and pull their way into the roof of the thing. In this case, much to the extreme annoyance of the driver, who swore like the devil and shouted out above the noise of the storm that he would be mogadored if a poxy upstart was going to climb all over his vehicle. Above the noise of the storm and the cursing, Dodger leaned down and said, "You must have heard of the man who brought down Sweeney Todd of the Demon Barber. Well, Cully, that was me. Yes, Dodger. Now you want to talk about it, or shall I get angry?" Dodger worked his way down so that he could hang on while talking to the man and said, "The person who owns the coach ahead of us is wanted for attempted murder, assault, and battery. Probably also for kidnapping a young lady and responsible for the death of a baby." With water pouring off him in every direction, the captain of the growler said, "What the hell you say?" "The hell I do indeed, sir," said Dodger, "and if I find that person before the peelers do, it'll be worse for him, and incidentally, of course, there will be a reward in all of this for you." The coachman, trying to keep the horse under control with lightning flashing around them, gave Dodger a sideways look in which was mingled anger, intrigue, and uncertain disbelief. "Oh, so he's got more to fear from you than the peelers, does he? They have damn big sticks, as I well know." He opened a mouth in which there appeared to just be one solitary tooth, adding, "We certainly know when they want to get their point across, those bastards." He spat, increasing the storm by the equivalent of about 3 raindrops, and gave Dodger a pitying look, then growled with another toothless grin. Well, how'll you be worse than the Peelers, my little lad, do tell me? Me? Because the Peelers have rules. I don't furky tootle around. And unlike the Peelers, when it comes to bashing, I don't have to stop. The growler, though, had come to a stop, a dead stop, and its driver cursed under his breath. Piccadilly Circus, Gov, all fouled up because of the rain. Tell you the truth, I can't tell which of these buggers is the one you're after, Chief, because people are cutting it in like Christmas dinner. I don't know why they're always messing around with the roads, but I reckon it's the 4 horses that are causing all this. They shouldn't be allowed in the city. People are walking around the road, too, like they own it. Hey, they got no sense. It was true. There were people dodging between stationary vehicles, and Piccadilly Circus was a pattern of umbrellas spinning through the growing host of rain-soaked vehicles, none of which could move until the others did. Now the horses were beginning to panic, and yet the other coaches, cabs, and 1 or 2 brewers' drays were piling in. Then, somewhere in the damp, jostling, frantic cauldron of frightened horses and bewildered pedestrians, someone must have stuck part of his umbrella up a horse's nose, causing what previous centuries would have called a hey-ho rumbelow, but what the growler captain called it could not be put on paper because it would have immediately caught fire. After that, there was nothing else for it. As the coachman said, if they want to get everybody out of here, they need to drag 1 or 2 coaches and dismantle the whole damn mess. With that, the sun came out, bright and shining in the clear blue sky, which made it even worse, because every human or horse who wasn't already so began to steam. Even Dodger could see that they lost their quarry with very little chance of finding it now. No point. Solomon was looking at him from the vehicle's window, holding up his huge pocket watch and pointedly showing him what time it was. Dodger groaned inwardly. If he gave in, then maybe, just maybe, when the seething fiasco was eventually unraveled, hopefully before any more fights started, he might be in the right place to hear the dreadful screeching wheel scream again. If he couldn't find out what he wanted from Mr. Bob, of course. But right now it was Solomon who was looking likely to be the one doing the screaming. Dodger turned back on the coachman, shrugged, and said, "How much, mister?" To the Dodger's surprise, the man gave a sly grin, waved his hand in the air to demonstrate the progress of the horse-drawn transport in the vicinity was a bucket of sheep droppings, and said, "You really think the geezer brought down Sweeney Todd? You look like a liar to me, but so does everybody else. Ugh. Never mind, just give me your signature on this little page I have here, making suitable mention of the fact that it was indeed you what have done it, and we'll call it quits. How about that? Because I think it'll be worth some money one day." Well, thought Dodger, this was Charlie's fog again. If the truth wasn't what you wanted it to be, you turned it into a different version of the truth. But the man was waiting patiently with a pencil and notebook. Taking them up and sweating, Dodger carefully scribed 1 letter at a time. "It was me that took down Sweeney Todd. Dodger, and that's true." As soon as he handed it back to the coachman, he was dragged to the curb by Solomon, who was frantically trying to open an umbrella, a black and treacherous thing that reminded Dodger of a long-dead, but nevertheless large bird of prey that could take your eye out if you let it. Dodger pointed out that right now, at least, it wasn't necessary, except, of course, for protection from the horses all around them, which were doing what horses regularly do, and doing it slightly more because they were in a state of panic. They headed on foot to Savile Row. The side streets were more busy with pedestrians than usual because of the tangle that they had thankfully left behind them. They arrived wet and warm, which can sometimes, as in this case, be worse than wet and cold because it includes sticky and horsey, at the shining polished door of Davies & Son at 38 Savile Row, leaving Onan at a lamppost, and on this occasion with a bone brought along for the purpose, in the company of which he was oblivious to the world. Once inside, Dodger tried not to be awed at the world of schmutter. After all, he knew there were swells who had much finer clothing than he ever wore, but seeing such a lot of it in one place would have been overwhelming if he let it be so. And it was. He tried to look like somebody who barely glances at this sort of thing because he sees it every day, although aware that the cleaned up but still quite fragrant shonky suit might be a clue that this was not entirely the case. But after all, a tailor is a tailor, and the rest of it is just shine. Eventually, they were handed into the care of Izzy, small and skinny, but nevertheless possessed of some inner nervous energy that would, in other circumstances, have turned a mill. He appeared like an arrow between Dodger and Solomon in the front of houseman who opens the door for them, talking all the time so fast that the best you could do was understand that Izzy would take care of everything, had everything, and everything was in hand, and if everybody left it to Izzy, everything would not just be all right, but also extremely acceptable in every possible way, and at a price that would amaze and yet satisfy all parties. If, and this was important, Izzy was allowed to get on with the job, thank you all so very much, he fussed Solomon and Dodger into one of the fitting rooms, never at any time ceasing to worry, fret, and to apologize to nobody in particular about nothing very much. A long cloth tape measure was whisked around his shoulders, and Dodger was pushed gently but firmly into the center of the room, where Izzy looked at him with the expression of a butcher faced with a particularly difficult steer, walking around him measuring by the Ponson mill-away method. And all this time, the only words he said to Dodger were variations of the theme of, "If you would just turn this way, sir," and "Sir this," and "Sir that," until Dodger was seriously in need of refreshment. It didn't help matters either when the spinning, dashing Izzy, apparently now with no alternative left to him, finally stopped with his mouth in the vicinity of Dodger's left ear, and in the tones of a man inquiring in the whereabouts of the Holy Grail, whispered, "How does one dress, sir?" This request was something of a problem for Dodger, who had never really given thought to the aspect of putting his clothes on. After all, it was just something you did. But the little tailor was standing by him as if he expected to learn the location of hidden treasure, and therefore he made an effort, saying, "Well, normally I'd put on yesterday's unmentionables if they ain't too bad, and then I pulls on my stockings. No, I tell a lie. Most days I put on my undershirt, then I put on my socks." It was at this point that Solomon crossed the room at the normal speed of a god, intending that the ungodly should be smitten, only to whisper something in Dodger's ear, causing the latter to say with some indignation, "How the hell should I know? I never bother to look. Things find their own way, don't they? What kind of question is that to ask a man, anyway?" Solomon laughed out loud and then went into a huddle with the ever-vibrating Izzy, who seemed to be actually still. Solomon and Izzy were chattering to one another in a language that went all over Europe and the Middle East, until at last Solomon said, "Luck of Dodger is building. Izzy says he can do us a wonderful deal. It appears that another tailor was told to work on a frock coat and a very elegant navy blue shirt, but regrettably one of Izzy's associates made a laughable mistake during the measurement, which meant that they would no longer fit the fine gentleman they were intended for. And so, my friend Izzy," Solomon continued, staring fixedly at Izzy, "has a little proposition for you, my friend." Izzy looked hesitantly at Solomon, like a man throwing a bone to a lion about to eat him, turned to Dodger and said hurriedly, "I could do you an excellent deal, young sir, on both the garments. They are happily only a stitch away from your requirements at a very spirited discount of 50%. Oh, that little telltale question in the statement which told the world that Izzy was just slightly uncertain, and even more worryingly for Izzy, he was uncertain of the face of Solomon's, in the face of Solomon's deadpan face. The bargaining had only just begun, and rather wisely, Izzy, with an eye on Solomon, dived to, "I beg your pardon, 75, oh no, 80%, and I'll throw in 2 pairs of very elegant unmentionables as well." Solomon smiled, and Izzy looked like a man who had not only been pardoned on the very steps of the gallows, but also had been given a purse full of sovereigns to atone for the misunderstanding. And 20 minutes later, a grateful Izzy sent Solomon and the hero of Fleet Street on their way, with Dodger clutching his new schmutter, Solomon carrying the bag containing the unmentionables, and Izzy now in the possession of some of the hero's reward. There was also courtesy of the management. Solomon's umbrella, which had been dried and brushed, and there was a growler waiting for them in the street. Well, not exactly. It was coming along the street right up until Solomon stood in front of it, waving the finger of God in the air, and the horse began to slow down before the coachman had time to pull on the reins, because horses know trouble when they see it. Dodger was quite careful to put Onan and his bone in the cab before the man had a chance to object. Onan tended to leave a certain onanness wherever he went. Once inside, Solomon made himself comfortable and said to the driver, "Lock and Co. of St. James, please, my man." He turned to a startled Dodger and said, "They will almost definitely have a hat for you there, my lad. Everyone who is anyone, or at least thought of everyone to be anyone, gets their hats there. I've got a hat from Jacob. That shonky thing, it looks like somebody used it as a concertina and handed it to a clown. You need a hat for a gentleman." "But I am not a gentleman," Dodger railed. "You will be much closer to one with an elegant hat for special occasions." And Dodger had to admit that the shonky hat, no doubt about it, was shonky. Generally, hats were not your friend when you were a tosher. They got knocked off your head far too easily. He often wore a thick leather cap, just good enough to save you from cracking your skull if you stood up too quickly in a small sewer, easy to keep clean. Everybody wore a hat of some kind, but the hats in the shop they stepped into now were extraordinary, and some were extremely high, and so, of course, Dodger pointed to the biggest one, which looked like a stovepipe, and called him with a siren voice in which only he could hear. I rather think this one will do me a treat. When he looked at his reflection in the mirror, he thought, oh yes, really sharp, sharp as a razor. He would be no end of a swell, where recently he had been no end of a smell, because no matter how hard you scrubbed, the curse of the tosher would always leave its own cheerful mark on you. Oh yes, this would do him. How amazed Simplicity would be when she saw such a splendid hat. However, it didn't do for Solomon, who considered the price of £1.18 to be grossly extravagant. Dodger was firm. True, it was a lot of money for something he didn't really need, but it was the principle of the thing. He didn't know exactly what the principle was, but it was a principle and it had a thing, and that was that. Besides, he pointed out that only the other day Solomon had said while he was working on one of his little machines that this thing needs oiling, and he continued relentlessly. Only the day before that, the old man had said this little lathe had wanted oil. Therefore, said Dodger, surely want is the same as need, yes? Solomon counted out the coins very slowly and in silence, and then said, Are you certain you weren't born Jewish? No, said Dodger. I've looked, I'm not, but thanks for the compliment. The last call before they went home was to a barber. A perfectly reasonable and careful barber who didn't include extras like having your throat cut. However, the poor fellow was unmanned when Solomon said, just as the barber was shaving Dodger, It might impress you, sir, if I told you that this gentleman you're now shaving was the hero paid to the activities of the nefarious Mr. Sweeney Todd. This intervention caused the man to panic, only a fraction, but nevertheless not a thing to do when you have just put a very sharp cutthroat razor to a man's throat. And it nearly caused another hey-ho-hey rumble-ho in the vicinity of Dodger's neck. The nick was not big, but the amount of blood was all out of proportion to the size, and so there was a great performance with a towel and an alum for the cut. It would certainly leave a scar, which was something of a bonus as far as Dodger was concerned. The hero of Fleet Street ought to sport something on his face to show for it. Then, once his face was tidy, and of course, Solomon had negotiated a friendly but firm way 6 months of free haircuts, they caught another growler home, and there was just about enough time to get washed, dressed, and generally smartened up. It was a while Dodger was sponging himself down, including the crevices, because, after all, this was a special occasion, he found part of himself thinking, what would I have to do to let someone die and then come alive again? Apart from being God, that is. Then, for some reason, the Dodger at the back of his head remembered the Crown and Anchormen with their dice, and the man with the P that you never ever found. Then, tumbling on top of that, there was the voice of Charlie saying that the truth is a fog, and in it people see what they want to see. And it seemed to him that around these little pictures a plot was plotting. He trod carefully so as to not disturb it, but wheels in his head were clearly turning, and he had to wait until something went click. The new clothes still fitted him exactly as promised, and Dodger wished that he had something more than a tiny piece of broken mirror in which to see himself in his finery. Then he pushed aside the curtain to ask Solomon's opinion, and was confronted by Solomon arrayed in all his glory. A man who usually wandered around in embroidered slippers or an old boot and wore a ragged black gabardine had suddenly become an old-fashioned but very smart gentleman with a fine black woolen Barathea jacket, dark blue pantaloon trousers, and long dark blue woolen stockings with ancient but well-kept court shoes sporting silver buckles that shone. But what amazed Dodger most of all was the large dark blue and gold medallion around Solomon's neck. He knew what the symbols were on the medallion, but Dodger had never associated them with this old man. They were the seal and the eye in the pyramid of the Freemasons. Finally, since Solomon had washed his beard and primped up, the whole effect appeared to have amazing power. And Dodger said so, which caused Solomon to smile and say, one day, my boy, I will tell you the name of the august personages who was gracious enough to give this to me. And may I say, Dodger, as always, you scrub up very well. One might almost take you for a real gentleman. It only remained very cautiously to give Onan his dinner and equally cautiously to take him for a little walk outside to do what he needed to do. They left him in dog heaven with another bone, and then there was nothing for it but to find another growler just as the evening fog was rising and head back west to number 1 Stratton Street, Wayfair. And that concludes chapter 11. We're very cleaned up, and we're ready for a dinner party. So we'll see how that goes in the next chapter.